For millions, Roy Clark was a symbol of pure, unadulterated joy. He was a master of the banjo, a picker, and a grinner, with a smile that could light up a room and a laugh that felt like home. From the cornfields of Hee-Haw to the glittering stages of Las Vegas, he was America's jovial country cousin, an entertainer who spent more than half a century making the world feel a little bit brighter. But after his passing, on November 15, 2018, when the stage lights went dark and the final curtain fell, going through the metaphorical closet of his life revealed a man far more complex and profound than his public persona ever let on. What his family and fans rediscovered wasn't a dark secret, but a narrative of staggering talent, deep-seated shyness, and quiet generosity. It was a story that challenged the caricature of a simple country comic, painting a portrait of a man who used his infectious public laughter to become one of the most influential figures in country music history. This is the story of the man behind the grin, and how the full measure of his life was, in its own way, an incredible revelation. Before we explore the depths of his legacy, it's essential to remember the Roy Clark the world knew and adored. Born on April 15, 1933, in Mehurin, Virginia, Roy Linwood Clark seemed destined for a life in music. His father, Hester, was a semi-professional musician himself, skilled on the banjo, fiddle, and guitar, filling their home with the sounds that would later define his son's career. Roy was a prodigy. By age 14, he was already playing guitar, and by 15, he had won 2 national banjo championships, earning him his first appearance on the legendary Grand Ole Opry. But his talent wasn't confined to a single instrument. Clark was a true virtuoso, a multi-instrumentalist who could seemingly master anything with strings. His fingers danced across the frets of a guitar with a speed and precision that left other musicians in awe. This immense skill, however, was coupled with a natural shyness. In his early years, Clark said, humor became his shield. He learned to be a comedian to mask his timidity, a trait that would become a signature part of his stage persona. He was the lovable country boy, quick with a joke and even quicker with a lick on the banjo. His career began its meteoric rise in the 1960s. After touring with rockabilly star Wanda Jackson, he caught the eye of Capitol Records and released his first solo album in 1962. He became a regular guest on The Tonight Show, and frequently filled in for Johnny Carson, which exposed him to a massive national audience beyond the traditional country music scene. This crossover appeal was his superpower. He could play a complex classical piece like Malaguena with the same ease as a down-home bluegrass tune, and he did it all with an accessible charm that won over hearts everywhere. Then came 1969, and the show that would cement his legacy forever, Hee-Haw. Alongside co-host Buck Owens, Clark became the face of country music for an entire generation. Every week, 30 million viewers tuned in to see Roy Epikin and Agrani. The show was a delightful mix of cornpone humor, down-home skits, and incredible musical performances. For nearly 25 years, he was a constant, comforting presence in living rooms across America. His success was staggering. He was named Entertainer of the Year by both the CMA and ACM. He won a Grammy Award, became a member of the Grand Ole Opry in 1987, and was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2009. In his personal life, he was seen as a devoted family man. He and his wife, Barbara, were married for 61 years, a testament to enduring love in the often turbulent world of show business. To his community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and his fans, Roy Clark was more than a star. He was a good man. He was generous, kind, and relentlessly positive. This was the image of Roy Clark, a man whose life was an open book, filled with music, laughter, and success. But in the quiet aftermath of his passing, his family and fans were about to appreciate a chapter they never knew existed, one that was hiding in plain sight. The air in Roy Clark's Tulsa home felt heavy that afternoon, not from the Oklahoma heat, but from the weight of memories that had been weeks since the world said goodbye to one of the most beloved entertainers in country music history. To millions, Roy Clark was a household name, a lightning-fast guitarist, a warm and witty host, a man who could make you laugh one moment and leave you breathless with a soulful ballad the next. But to the family gathered here today, he was simply Roy, the husband, the father, the grandfather. They had come to do what every grieving family must eventually face: go through the belongings of the one they've lost. The house was a time capsule of his life: stage-worn boots tucked in the corner, faded photographs from tour stops in towns both big and small, and the faint scent of his aftershave lingering in the air. And then there was the closet. It stood in the far corner of his private study, tall and made of rich, dark wood. Unlike the other doors in the house, this one was locked. Few, if any, could remember the last time it had been opened. Some weren't even sure they had ever seen what was inside. While sorting through his desk, one of the family members found a small, tarnished brass key buried under a pile of old sheet music. For a moment, they all froze. The key felt heavy in the hand, as if holding not just metal, but the weight of years gone by. Someone whispered, "Should we?" They should. And they did. The lock clicked. The hinges groaned. and what they found behind that door would leave them stunned, wiping tears from their eyes, and forever changed the way they remembered Roy Clark. Roy Linwood Clark was born April 15, 1933, in the tiny community of Mayhair, Virginia. Life there was simple. Neighbors waved from porches, church bells marked the weeks, and kids made their own fun with little more than a rope swing and imagination. But the Clark household had something else: music. Roy's father, a skilled amateur musician, played the banjo and guitar. Music filled the small home not as background noise, but as a way of connecting, of sharing stories without words. One day, when Roy was still a boy, his father placed a banjo in his hands. The neck was a little too big for his small fingers, the strings a little too stiff, but from the first awkward pluck, Roy was hooked. He practiced until his fingers ached. By his teenage years, he wasn't just good, he was a prodigy. He could switch effortlessly between banjo, guitar, mandolin, and fiddle. The neighbors called him the boy who could make wood and strings talk. But music wasn't just talent, it was his ticket out of poverty. And Roy knew it. In the 1950s, Roy cut his teeth as a touring musician, playing wherever he could, bars, fairs, even tiny radio stations that paid more in sandwiches than in cash. He backed artists like Wanda Jackson and Jimmy Dean, slowly building a reputation as the guy who could do it all. Then came 1969. Television audiences were introduced to a new variety show, Hee Haw. It was part comedy, part music, and all heartland charm. And right at the center was Roy Clark, with his quick grin, ready jokes, and the kind of guitar solos that made jaws drop. For nearly 25 years, Hee Haw became a Saturday night tradition in millions of homes, and Roy became more than a musician. Became family to his viewers. He played stages from Nashville to Moscow, collected Grammy nominations, and earned a place in the Country Music Hall of Fame. But for all the bright lights and applause, Roy never lost sight of where he came from. Publicly, Roy was warm and approachable, but privately, he was reserved. He had his circle of close friends, his wife Barbara, and his family, and beyond that, he kept some things to himself. Even in his home, there were spaces that felt off limits, not because of secrecy in a scandalous sense, but because Roy was a man who valued keeping parts of his life untouched by the public eye. And among those private places was the closet in his study, a door rarely approached, never opened. The day the family decided to sort through Roy's study was a mix of laughter and tears. Someone would pull out a rhinestone jacket, and a story would follow how Roy wore it during a concert in Vegas, how the lights caught the fabric and made him look like he was glowing. They found handwritten set lists from shows, notes scrawled in the margins of sheet music, and little doodles he'd made on napkins during long tours. Then came the question, what about the closet? The tall door stood in the corner like it was watching them. Finding the key felt almost fatita small, forgotten thing tucked under yellowed papers. When they brought it to the lock, there was a moment of hesitation. This was Roy's private base. Did they have the right? But grief changes the rules, and curiosity pushed the door open. The closet was deeper than expected, with shelves on both sides and garment bags hanging neatly. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something older itself. Maybe. They began to unpack, thinking they'd find old clothes or perhaps more instruments. And at first, they did. But the deeper they dug, the stranger the contents became, because tucked among the stage outfits and banjos were items that told a story one Roy had kept hidden for decades. The first layers were a music lover's dream, a banjo with his initials engraved given to him by a fellow musician in 1964, a guitar with worn frets, still carrying the faint scent of the stage, reels of magnetic tape labeled in his own handwriting songs that no one had ever heard, private recordings meant for his ears alone. There were embroidered shirts from his early touring days, boots scuffed from years of performing, and a stack of Hee Haw scripts with jokes he'd personally added in pen. Then came the letters. They were bundled with ribbon, some yellowed with age. One was from a young boy in Texas, thanking Roy for sending him a guitar after his parents couldn't afford one. Another from a fellow musician, saying Roy had saved his career by lending him money during a rough patch. And tucked between them a leather-bound journal. Inside, in his familiar handwriting, Roy wrote not about fame or music, but about people, strangers he'd met, children he'd taught, families he'd helped. These entries weren't written for anyone else's eyes. They were private reflections on acts of kindness he never wanted publicized. At the very back, under a quilt, was a plain wooden box. Inside were photographs of people the family didn't recognize, standing outside small houses, in music classrooms, in hospital rooms. Alongside them were receipts, donation records, and thank you notes. It became clear Roy Clark had been quietly funding music programs, paying medical bills, and giving financial help to struggling families for decades. He never sought credit. He never even told his own family. The room was silent as they looked through the box. Tears fell freely, not from sadness alone, but from the overwhelming pride of knowing just how deep Roy's kindness ran. They had always known him as a generous man, But this was different. This was a life of service, lived in secret. When word eventually spread, fans reacted with awe. Letters and online tributes poured in. People shared their own stories. Roy had bought them an instrument, covered a bill, or offered encouragement that changed their lives. Roy Clark's name was already etched in country music history. But this discovery added a new era reminder that the truest measure of a person's greatness isn't the applause they receive on stage, but the quiet good they do when no one is watching. Roy Clark's closet didn't just hold clothes. An instrument set held his heart. And now, the question is yours to answer. If you found a loved one's hidden legacy of kindness, would you share it with the world, or keep it as your private treasure? While the world saw the pickin' and grinning, few understood the quiet, and sometimes shy, man behind the curtain. His autobiography was titled My Life in Spite of Myself, a nod to the fact that his enormous success often felt at odds with his own reserved nature. Friends and family knew him as a gentle and kind soul, whose public persona was a brilliant performance designed to overcome his natural timidity. Tributes after his death painted a fuller picture. Brad Paisley recalled how, after the Nashville floods destroyed his guitars, Roy simply showed up and gave him one of his own. Vince Gill tearfully remembered being a young boy watching Roy play, and later becoming his friend, stating, "You just are grateful that you got to share a little stretch of your life with one of your heroes." Dolly Parton called him one of the greatest ever, adding, "I loved him dearly, and he will be missed." This generosity was a core part of his private life. In 1978, Roy Clark Elementary School was named in his honor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he remained actively involved with the school for decades. He was a pillar of his community, but he did it without fanfare. He was a man whose immense fame never seemed to inflate his ego. In a 2005 interview, he admitted he still found it hard to believe that kids looked up to him the way he looked up to his own idols. This humility was the true man. The grin was for the audience. The quiet generosity and shy, gentle spirit were for the people who truly knew him. The shocking truth left for his family wasn't a scandal, but the overwhelming evidence of a life lived with profound kindness and humility. A stark contrast to the boisterous character he played on TV. The rediscovery of Roy Clark's legacy fundamentally rewrote the story of a beloved American icon for a new generation. The closet didn't contain skeletons, but rather, a treasure trove of overlooked achievements and quiet virtues. To the world, he was the embodiment of joy, a master entertainer whose grin was as famous as his guitar licks. But in reality, he was a shy genius, a global ambassador for music, and a deeply humble and generous man. The family, grappling with their loss, was left with an even deeper appreciation for the man they loved. They saw not a caricature, but a complex and brilliant artist who wielded his talent and humor to bring people together. His career was his testimony, and his kindness was his true signature. The story of Roy Clark is a powerful reminder that what we see on screen is often just one small part of a much larger, more impressive picture. He smiled for the cameras, and the world smiled back. But the full, astounding truth of his talent, his impact, and his gentle spirit was the most wonderful discovery of all. Asterisk.